Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are deconstructing a pretty heavily debated segment from the Young Turks. Now, right off the bat, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're just looking to objectively unpack the claims, the raw data, and the political narratives they present about the Middle East conflict. We're going to look really closely at how this specific analysis takes newly reported military data and uses it to build this much larger argument, touching on everything from foreign policy and military readiness to the global economy. Let's get into it.
So we have to start with the core question driving their entire analysis. How much damage have US military sites actually sustained in the Middle East? The overarching narrative presented by the host is that, basically, the public has been kept in the dark. And that sets the stage for a much broader critique of US foreign policy and a perceived lack of military transparency.
Here is exactly how we'll unpack these claims today. First, we'll look at the Washington Post report. Second, assessing strike precision. Third, US military vulnerabilities. Fourth, political leadership and blame. And finally, global economic fallout.
All right, Section 1, the Washington Post report.
So the analysis builds its case by looking at a pretty stark timeline, and it highlights a massive discrepancy in the data about infrastructure damage. Early on in the war, Iranian strikes reportedly crippled depleted US radar and missile defense systems, right? But publicly, the understanding seemed relatively contained. In fact, just last week, reports are saying only 16 US installations were damaged. But then, an exclusive review of satellite imagery up to April 14th came out, and it tells a very different and way more destructive story.
And the sheer scale of that damage is really the foundational data point here. The Washington Post analysis revealed that at least 228 structures or pieces of equipment at US military sites were damaged or destroyed. 228! It's this specific number that anchors the source's overarching claim the situation on the ground is just significantly more severe than leadership had previously acknowledged.
And these weren't just random hits in empty fields or, strikes on perimeter fences. The report details intentional strikes that crippled absolutely vital communication and defense infrastructure. We're talking hangars, barracks, fuel depots, aircraft, and crucial radar and air defense equipment. This very specific list of targets effectively sets up the segment's next major argument about modern warfare. Which brings us to Section 2, assessing strike precision.
Here, the source's commentary draws a really sharp, polarizing contrast when it comes to modern military tactics. It characterizes the Iranian strikes as highly targeted, precise, and responsibly focused strictly on military sites. And then it directly contrasts that against US and Israeli bombings, which the analysis vehemently labels as indiscriminate. The hosts assert that these bombings are intentional attacks hitting civilian infrastructure, places like schools, universities, and hospitals. They even use a term they call the Israelization of military tactics to describe what they see as a disturbing shift.
To really back up this claim of precision, the analysis leans heavily on a quote from strategic expert Mark Hansian, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. After he reviewed the satellite data, Hansian noted, there are no random craters indicating misses. The argument they're making here is that Iran, despite decades of warnings about their threat level, has actually demonstrated a highly disciplined, very effective approach to targeting.
Moving right along to Section 3, US military vulnerabilities.
According to the strategic analysis in the segment, this level of precision exposed three critical flaws in US military readiness. First up, threat assessment. They argue the US severely underestimated Iran's targeting abilities. Second, technological adaptation. Basically, a massive failure to adapt fast enough to modern drone warfare. And third, infrastructure defense. The source points out that these oversights left several bases dangerously underprotected against incoming, highly sophisticated attacks.
And as a direct result of those deep vulnerabilities, the narrative points to a literal physical retreat. The sheer danger of incoming air attacks meant regional US bases were simply way too risky to staff at normal levels. This essentially forced commanders to take drastic action. They had to execute a massive evacuation, moving most of their personnel completely out of the range of Iranian fire right at the very start of the conflict.
Okay, Section 4, political leadership and blame.
At this point, the commentary pivots from the battlefield directly to the Oval Office. It places the blame for these failures squarely on former President Donald Trump. The host characterizes him as fundamentally ill-prepared and ill-informed. They point out he expressed absolute shock over the Iranian retaliation and completely failed to anticipate massive strategic moves like the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. The argument strongly asserts that he was essentially led astray, tricked into this incredibly vulnerable position by surrounding himself exclusively with pro-Israel advisors.
Now, the host fiercely defends this political critique against any accusations of anti-Semitism. The explicit argument they present is that calling out the influence of these specific pro-Israel advisors doesn't rob the former president of his own agency. Instead, they argue it just highlights terrible, disastrous foreign policy advice that, in their view, ultimately benefits no one and leaves the US military dangerously exposed.
And our final section, Section 5, Global Economic Fallout.
The segment wraps up by zooming way out to offer a highly controversial redefinition of global geopolitical tension. The overarching theory they present is that the current widespread global disdain directed toward Israel isn't fundamentally driven by anti-Semitism. Instead, they argue it's driven by economics. The claim is that decades of endless regional wars are quite literally crushing everyday people worldwide, and it's that profound economic pain, not necessarily ideology, that is the true underlying source of the international frustration we are seeing boiling over today.
So we'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. As regional conflicts continue to drain the global economy, and as hard, independent satellite data exposes these brand new vulnerabilities in modern drone warfare, what are the real, long-term strategic costs for the United States? It is a deeply complex web of military readiness, political advisory, and global economics. Thanks for joining us as we unpack